He was the prototype for the killer in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He felt no remorse after killing. He was also Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, who killed and skinned people to make crafts. He was also the inspiration for the killer in Psycho, a murderous demon imprisoned by his mother's obsessive love. Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. I'm your host, DarkCaseX. This case took place in a state in the American Midwest, Wisconsin. It is abbreviated as WI. It covers an area of nearly 170,000 square kilometers, with a population of over 5 million. The state's name comes from the French interpretation of a Native American place name meaning the place where we live. In the 1950s, a brutal murderer was born here, Edward Theodore Gein. At least 3 people died at his hands. Compared to other serial killers, this number isn't high, but the horrific acts he committed against his victims shocked American society at the time. The media even gave him the title, the Butcher of Plainfield. He became one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Later, his story was adapted into several classic films. Besides the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the skin-peeling serial killer, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, was also based on him. However, this man known as the Butcher of Plainfield was actually a very quiet, introverted, and even shy person in real life. So back then, what exactly did this unremarkable, middle-aged man go through to cause such a shock to all of American society? Now let's travel back to 1906 and take you through the details of this case once again. On August 27th, 1906, Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He had an older brother, Henry, who was 6 years his senior. His mother, Augusta, was a very domineering woman. She was a fanatical worshiper of God. She single-handedly ran a small grocery store, which was the family's only source of income. Her strong personality, coupled with financial control, gave her supreme authority at home. All matters in the family, big or small, were decided by her. In contrast, his father, George, had no steady job and was idle all day long. Not only that, he was an alcoholic and a weak-willed person. He had worked at different times as a carpenter, tambourine, and insurance salesman. Being chronically unemployed, he was indifferent to family matters. Faced with his wife's daily scolding, he had long lost interest in responding. Over time, the couple's relationship became extremely poor. In such an environment, the upbringing that Gein and Henry received is easy to imagine. From childhood, their mother, Augusta, instilled certain ideas in her 2 children, which can be summarized as, "Your father is a useless piece of filth. None of you men are any good. You're all losers, boys. Stay away from those women. They are devils." She also terrorized her sons, saying women were dangerous creatures. She would constantly preach about sex, the importance of God, and that sinners will surely go to hell, trying various methods to force her sons to lose interest in the opposite sex. For all these reasons, Gein remained unmarried until his death. The crimes Gein later committed can be said to be directly related to his mother Augusta's method of education, and although the alcoholic father was submissive to his wife, he presented a different face to his sons. He would often be violent towards the 2 children. Everything that happened at home, in Gein's eyes, was just as his mother said. His father was a loser, a man who couldn't be relied upon. This led Gein to develop a perverted dependence on his mother's authority. In 1914, his mother, Augusta, thought the place they lived was terrible, simply because it was their father, George's hometown. She was afraid that her children would grow up to be like George, good for nothing. So she sold the property and moved the whole family to Plainfield, Wisconsin. In the desolate outskirts of this small town, she bought a nearly 200-acre farm. Calling this place outskirts is a bit of an understatement because it was extremely remote. The nearest neighbor was over 2 kilometers away. In other words, the place was very secluded. Normally, no one would ever come to visit the Gein family. You could say they were social outcasts struggling in poverty. Soon, Gein reached school age. At school, he was a very introverted and withdrawn person. His mother warned him to always be wary of others and not to talk much with classmates at school, especially females. Young Gein could only obey his mother's teachings, subconsciously isolating himself in another world. As a result, he had no friends at school. Gein was also severely bullied at school. often being mocked by his classmates. His favorite thing to do was to hide in a corner of the classroom and read by himself. Only under his mother's authoritarian control did he find a small sense of security. Once, Gein went crying to his father, saying he was being bullied at school. Unexpectedly, because George was drunk, he beat him. When his mother, Augusta, later found out, she did not comfort Gein, nor did she blame George. Instead, she thought her husband George had some masculinity. The dull and tedious farm life also led George to drink heavily all day. In his view, alcohol was everything. Ultimately, alcohol was also what took his life. In April 1940, George died of a malignant respiratory disease. His father's death did not cause much of a stir in the family. Augusta even told her two sons, that old man George would definitely go to hell. She attributed George's death to his weakness, saying it was God's punishment for the weak. This terrified Gein. He was very worried he would end up like his father. After George's death, the two brothers, Henry and Gein, started doing odd jobs to supplement the family income. The older brother, Henry, preferred jobs at grocery stores and manual labor jobs. Gein, on the other hand, liked to find work taking care of children. This wasn't because Henry was more hardworking than Gein. The main reason was that, under his mother's long-term twisted education, Gein's personality developed major flaws. It was difficult for him to communicate normally with people. In his view, only when he was with children did he feel more at ease. Although the two brothers were quiet, they were very diligent in their work. The town's residents always had a good opinion of them. They described Gein as very quiet, a little strange, shy, and very kind. So some might ask, why was the older brother Henry relatively normal? Because Augusta's method of educating her two sons, though the same, the older brother Henry was more mature and rational than his younger brother. He had the ability to think independently. He often opposed his mother's views, which led to verbal abuse from her. In early 1944, Henry fell in love with a divorced woman and planned to spend the rest of his life with her. But this was met with strong opposition from his mother. From then on, mother and son seemed to become enemies. As he got older, these family arguments became more and more common. In Gein's eyes, this was an incredible thing, because in his heart, the image of his mother was great, mighty, kind, and inviolable. His brother actually dared to defy their mother. This left him very confused. Therefore, the two brothers did not have a good relationship. Gein couldn't understand his brother's defiance of their mother. Henry was also very disgusted with his younger brother's excessive dependence on their mother. Finally, one day, this conflict was resolved by human intervention. On the evening of May 16, 1944, Gein went to the town's sheriff's office. He said a fire broken out a few days earlier, and his brother Henry, while fighting the fire, was accidentally burned to death. When the police arrived at the farm, they did indeed find traces of a fire. The fire location was a small cabin next to a swamp. The cabin was completely unrecognizable, but the police still found some suspicious points. First, the place where Gein said he found Henry's body had no traces of being burned. Second, Henry's head had extensive bruising. The shape looked as if it was caused by a blunt object. Third, the estimated time of death was around noon on May 15th, but Gein didn't report it until the evening of the 16th. Although Henry's death was very strange, the police ultimately ruled it an accidental death. No formal investigation was conducted, and no autopsy was performed. It's unknown if the police at the time were negligent, or if they were unwilling to believe that the shy and naive Gein would kill his own brother. In fact, Henry was killed by Gein. This was later admitted by Gein himself. Henry's death was a huge blow to his mother, Augusta. For a long time, her mental state was very poor. She kept blaming herself for not taking good care of Henry. On December 29, 1945, Augusta died of pneumonia, a stroke, and other complications. She was 67 years old. Gein was overcome with grief at his mother's death. This marked the collapse of his spiritual pillar. On one hand, there was a sense of inner liberation. On the other hand, it left him at a complete loss. He sealed up his mother's room like a museum. All the objects were placed just as they always had been. He also kept his mother's body at home for a long week before finally burying her. His mother's death stunted his emotional connection with normal people and even his emotional perception of a normal environment. It was greatly hindered This destined him to find some amusement for himself. At night, he would put on his mother's clothes and walk around the house dressed as his mother, trying to bring his beloved mother back. These are all things Gein later admitted himself. His other pleasure was reading. Books became Gein's solace. Later, after the county police solved the case, the books found in Gein's home were mainly of two types: anatomy books and books about live experiments during World War II. At this time, Gein was nearly 40 years old. Looking back at his life, it can be described in two words: lonely and loss of self. In this world, he no longer had any relatives or friends. Only the empty farm kept him company. Perhaps to others in the town, Gein was just a lonely, quiet bachelor. But what people didn't know was that Gein, who had lived his life in a psychological cage built by his mother, Gein, who had lived his life in a closed world with his mother as the sole focus, after his mother's death, had begun to construct his own incredibly rich inner world. Eventually, dressing up as his mother was no longer enough for him. Gein, madly missing his mother, began visiting her grave at night. Finally, one late night, he dug up his mother's body. 304. 000T024, 333 to 0 hours, 9 minutes and 25 seconds, 700, broke off her head and hands, and kept them. Beginning in 1946, Gein began to frequently rob graves. His targets were mostly recently buried, middle-aged women. He would take some of the bodies home, then skin them, and make various handicrafts. During this period, Gein would go to various pre-selected locations in the first half of the night to rob graves. In the second half of the night, he returned to the farm, working feverishly under the dim oil lamp. Some body parts, such as breasts, female genitalia, etc., were made into specimens and hung on his bedpost as decorations. The skin was peeled off and made into a female skin suit. He often wore this woman's skin and moved around the farm. The remote farm provided Gein with a free kingdom of fantasy. He lived in what he believed to be a glorious and sacred world. The incredibly interesting human experiments, anatomy, and the female form. All of this made him obsessed and crazy. But slowly, dead bodies could no longer satisfy his perverted psychological desires. On the evening of December 8, 1954, Gein went to a bar in Plainfield. It was a small bar near the outskirts of town. 52-year-old Mary Hogan was the owner. Later, according to Gein, Hogan's appearance and physique were very similar to his mother, Augusta. Gein waited until all the customers had left. He shot and killed Hogan with a pistol, then took her body home. He hung it up and shot at the body, then skinned it, performing his usual human experiment procedures. Because Gein cleaned up the scene, the police initially treated the case as a kidnapping. They found no valuable clues. On November 16, 1957, in the small town, there was a hardware store that also sold daily necessities. 55-year-old Bernice Worden was the owner. Her son, Frank Worden, was a deputy at the county sheriff's department. As dusk approached, Frank went to the hardware store to pick up his mother for dinner. He noticed something was very wrong. The lights in the store were off, and the door was closed. Upon entering the room, he found a lot of blood. He immediately notified the sheriff's department, and an investigation was immediately launched. According to his recollection, the day before his mother disappeared, Gein had been in the store and had asked a lot of questions about his own schedule for that day. He then left without buying anything. Thus, Gein became the prime suspect. The police went to Gein's farm to investigate. The overwhelming stench and garbage everywhere made one wonder if this was a garbage disposal plant. The main door was locked, so the police could only enter through the storage room. And in the storage room alone, they found the following things. A body hanging upside down. The abdominal cavity was cut open from the groin to the throat. At first, the police couldn't determine what it was. The body's head was cut off, the internal organs were removed, and the limbs were hung upside down with hooks. Only upon closer inspection did the police realize that they were looking at a human corpse. The head was placed aside. The skin on the face had been peeled off. This body was that of Frank's mother, Bernice Worden, and this storage room was where Gein specifically processed the bodies. These discoveries horrified the police. After conducting a further search, they gradually discovered that this place was like hell. Bernice's heart was found in a dinner plate. In addition, they also found several bowls made from human skulls. There was a skull on the bedpost. In a drawer, there were many face skins. On the table was a sharp knife made from human bone. There were lampshades, vests, gloves, chairs, etc., made of human skin, and many more bizarrely imaginative handicrafts. This shocking evidence took the police nearly 2 days to document everything until the night of the 19th, Gein brazenly returned to the farm. Seeing so many police officers, his first words were, "If you're here to investigate the murder at the hardware store, I don't know anything." Such a response was like a confession without being prompted. He was immediately arrested by the police. Initially, Gein did not admit to killing anyone, but after several days of intense interrogation, and as more and more evidence was discovered, Gein finally began to confess his crimes, including how he plotted to kill Mrs. Warden and how he killed his own brother, among other things. He also admitted to repeatedly going to the local cemetery late at night between 1947 and 1951 to dig up bodies. But regarding the processing of many of the bodies, Gein said his memory was very hazy and he couldn't remember. Ultimately, based on the remains found at the farm, the police confirmed at least 30 bodies. Although Gein said the other body parts were all dug up from the cemetery, the police firmly believed that he was also responsible for other murders. But there was never any solid evidence to prove it. The technical means of the time were very backward. To quickly identify these bodies, the simplest and most effective method was to check the graves that Gein claimed to have robbed. Finally, after obtaining permission from the families of the deceased, investigators checked these graves. The results showed that the graves Gein pointed out indeed had clear signs of being robbed. The bodies in some of these graves were missing. As for the motive for robbing the graves, it was even more bizarre. Gein stated that not long after his mother's death, he wished he could become a woman. So he stole many women's bodies to make a suit to complete his so-called transformation. He also emphasized that he just liked to wear these bodies and had not eaten any of the bodies or engaged in necrophilia. In subsequent interrogations, Gein showed no signs of remorse for what he had done. He appeared very calm. When describing some of the processes, he even showed a happy expression. It all seemed very normal to him. So much so that everyone began to wonder if Gein was even a normal person. On October 21st, 1957, when the court heard the case, there was an unexpected outcome. Gein underwent a psychiatric evaluation by the state mental health institution. The results showed that Gein had indeed suffered psychological and mental trauma. After about 30 days of mental tests, Gein was deemed mentally outside the normal range, showing signs of chronic schizophrenia. Therefore, he was unfit for trial and was sent to the Central State Hospital for criminal psychiatric treatment. Gein's farm was scheduled to be auctioned on March 30th, 1958. The estimated value at the time was $4,700. But on March 20th, someone secretly set a fire and burned it to the ground. The arsonist has never been found. It wasn't until November 7th, 1968, that the court retried Gein's case. The court granted the defense's request to agree that this trial would be conducted without a jury. It was presided over by Judge Robert Golmar. Doctors from both the prosecution and the defense testified in court. Judge Robert ultimately ruled that Gein was not guilty by reason of insanity. He was once again ordered to the Central State Hospital for criminal psychiatric treatment. He remained there until his death from cancer on July 26, 1984. There are two main points to Gein's criminal psychology. First, gender dysphoria. Let's consider a simple question. How does a person determine their own gender? The answer seems obvious. But here's the question. If a person with male characteristics feels like they are a girl, what would be like? This condition is called gender dysphoria. Simply put, it's a mismatch between biological sex and gender identity. This can lead to various kinds of pain and functional loss. It's worth emphasizing that Gein's gender dysphoria was acquired in the presence of his mother, who represented supreme and absolute authority. He developed a strong psychological instinct of dependence. His father, a symbol of weakness, was ultimately punished by God and died. He was even said to be going to hell. Subconsciously, his father became a negative role model. Therefore, Gein was terrified of becoming like his father. He wanted to be like his mother, a figure with absolute control. Under this dominant emotion, he gradually developed a perverted psychology of wanting to change his gender. That's why he later wore a human skin suit, wanting to undergo a sex change. Second point, a compensatory psychology aimed at conquest and control. Gein, in his special living environment, due to his personality being extremely susceptible to suggestion and submissive, developed an intensified worship of his mother as an individual. 543. 001T649, 700 to 0 hours, 16 minutes and 51 seconds, 900. He claimed it was out of sexual desire. In reality, what he worshipped was the power and sense of conquest associated with the female role, and that weak men would go to hell. This idea, instilled in him since childhood, pushed Gein to an extreme. What exactly must one do to not be considered weak? This is where Gein differs from other killers. Other killers might strangle, rape, and so on. But for Gein, who had necrophilic tendencies, killing people who were not weak would prove that he was not weak. Using people who were not weak to satisfy his own hobbies. 559. 001T721, 06, 6 to 0 hours, 17 minutes and 23 seconds, 466, could maximize this sense of conquest. And who were the people who were not weak? In Gein's eyes, it was simple. First, his mother was like a god-like existence. Then there were women, like his mother. So the choice of victims becomes clear. Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan had many similarities to Gein's mother. Gender, age, appearance, strong personality, etc. If Gein hadn't been caught, there might have been more victims. After this incident was exposed, it sparked heated discussions in the American media. Although there were only 3 confirmed victims, the true number of victims remains unknown to this day. Before Gein's farmhouse was burned down, many people traveled from afar to get a glimpse of the psychopathic killer's farmhouse. The originally unknown small town suddenly attracted a large number of tourists. Later, the number 666 was carved on Gein's tombstone. In the West, this represents the devil, Satan. Gein was indeed a devil, and his mother was more like a devil maker. His older brother, Henry, still had the ability to think independently and have his own ideas, but in Gein's eyes, his mother was everything. The collapse of paternal authority left Gein without a role model. Twisted maternal love created the demon in Gein's heart. Until his death in the hospital, Gein still had no friends. Right before he died, he still believed he had wronged his mother. Because he killed individuals who were very similar to his mother, he felt extremely guilty and ashamed towards his mother. So he specifically emphasized that he should not be buried next to his mother's tombstone. He did not want to be near his mother again. He felt no remorse for the innocent victims and his grave robbing activities. But because he killed people who looked like his mother, he felt guilty towards his mother. To have developed such a twisted psychology, one can see what a terrible childhood Gein spent under his mother's authority. In fact, many criminals have tragic childhoods. But does everyone who has experienced tragedy become a criminal? The answer is obviously no. Some people use misfortune as a driving force for progress to enhance their self-worth and are committed to breaking out of their circumstances. Others prefer to just get by, going further and further in the wrong direction, which eventually turns into one tragedy after another. Gein certainly has aspects that make one pause. His experiences are sympathetic, but when he turned his own misfortune into crime, it can no longer be understood with the simple word sympathy. This incident happened more than 70 years ago. Nowadays, I believe similar tragedies will not be repeated. Alright, that was the story of the Butcher of Plainfield, Edward Gein. If you liked this video, please show your support by giving it a like. Your support is a great encouragement to me. I'm DarkCaseX, and I'll see you next time.